Nestled in the shadow of New York's Catskill Mountains, a small Dutch village once stood. A quiet, timeless place where life ticked by, like the gentle creak of a rocking chair on a front porch. Here, surrounded by rolling hills and whispering pines, lived a man whose name would become legend, Rip Van Winkle. Rip wasn't a man of great ambition. In fact, you could say he lived to do as little as possible. With a kind smile and a knack for storytelling, he was beloved by children and admired by the men who often joined him in idling away the hours at the local inn. Hard work, however, that wasn't Rip's strong suit. Understandably, this didn't sit well with Rip's wife, a stern, sharp-tongued woman who saw her husband's laziness as a personal affront. Dame Van Winkle scolded Rip from dawn until dusk, her voice ringing through the valley like an unrelenting bell. For Rip, there seemed to be no escape from her nagging, except perhaps the woods that stretched endlessly beyond the edges of the village. And so, on one fateful autumn afternoon, Rip decided to trade his wife's tirades for the tranquility of the mountains. With his trusty dog, Wolf, at his side and his fowling piece slung over his shoulder, Rip ascended into the forest, far away from the troubles of home. The woods were an enchanted place, or so the villagers often said. The Catskill Mountains were steeped in legend, their mist-shrouded peaks hiding secrets as old as time itself. Rip reveled in the fresh air, the crunch of leaves underfoot, and the sudden calls of birds echoing through the trees. He wandered aimlessly, letting the beauty of the landscape ease his troubled mind. As the sun began to dip low in the sky, casting warm golden light across the forest floor, Rip found himself stopping near a rocky hollow. That's when he heard it. A distant, mysterious sound that made his hair stand on end. It was faint at first, like the rumble of thunder, but then it grew closer, a steady, rhythmic boom. It sounded almost like the rolling of ninepins, the old Dutch version of bowling. Curious, Rip followed the noise. He soon stumbled upon a strange sight. A group of men, short, stout, and dressed in an antiquated style, gathered in a clearing. They were playing ninepins, their solemn faces framed by long beards that seemed as ancient as the mountains themselves. Despite their odd clothes and the air of secrecy about them, the men paid Rip no mind. One of them silently handed him a flagon of liquor, motioning for him to drink. Rip, being Rip, saw no harm in accepting. The beverage was unlike anything he'd ever tasted, rich, heady, and somehow magical. Before long, a warm drowsiness overtook him. His eyelids drooped, his head. When Rip awoke, it was to the chirping of birds and the golden rays of morning filtering through the trees. For a moment, he thought he'd only napped the night away. But as he stretched and sat up, he felt an unfamiliar stiffness in his joints, as though he'd aged decades overnight. The clearing was empty. The mysterious men were gone, and so was his faithful dog, Wolf. Even his gun, which had always been a reliable companion, was no longer the polished, trusty weapon he'd carried into the woods. Now it was rusted, its strap frayed and brittle. His head grew heavy, and Rip sank onto the mossy ground. When Rip awoke, it was to the chirping of birds and the golden rays of morning filtering through the trees. For a moment, he thought he'd only napped the night away. But as he stretched and sat up, he felt an unfamiliar stiffness in his joints, as though he'd aged decades overnight. The clearing was empty. The mysterious men were gone, and so was his faithful dog, Wolf. Even his gun, which had always been a reliable companion, was no longer the polished, trusty weapon he'd carried into the woods. Now it was rusted, its strap frayed and brittle. Confused and uneasy, Rip stumbled back down the mountain, eager to return to the comfort of his village. But as the first cottages came into view, Rip froze. Something was different. The tidy little Dutch homes he'd known had aged, their shingles rotted and their paint faded. The people bustling through the village square were strangers, dressed in new-fashioned clothes and speaking in unfamiliar tones. Rip felt a cold pit of fear settle in his stomach. What had happened to his quiet little village while he slept? Searching for answers, Rip wandered into town. He found the inn where he'd spent many happy hours years before, but even its sign had changed. Where once it bore the portrait of King George III, it now portrayed a man in a cocked hat. None other than General George Washington. Rip stood dumbfounded, staring at the sign as villagers began to gather, whispering among themselves at the sight of this old, bearded stranger. Rip's first instinct was to ask after his friends, the familiar faces he'd spent so many evenings with. But one by one, he was met with the same reply. Most of them were gone, either passed away or scattered during the tumult of the Revolutionary War. The world had moved forward without him, new leaders had risen, and the once loyal British colony had become a young and independent America. Finally, Rip asked about Dame Van Winkle. A murmur swept through the crowd, and an old woman leaned close to whisper that his wife had passed many years ago. At this news, Rip couldn't help but feel a conflicted mix of relief and sadness. As he stood, bewildered, in the village square, one voice finally broke through the sea of confusion. "That's Rip Van Winkle. Could it really be him?" An old man, bent with age, peered closely at Rip's face. He remembered him from the days long before the Revolution. With his identity confirmed, Rip began to piece together the truth. The strange liquor he had drunk in the mountains had not knocked him out for a night. It had stolen 20 years of his life. In that time, the world had reshaped itself, leaving Rip as a relic of a forgotten era. For most people, this revelation might have been crushing, but not Rip Van Winkle. He was, at heart, an easygoing soul. Now free from the responsibilities of farm work and the tyranny of Dame Van Winkle's nagging, he settled into a new routine. He moved in with his grown daughter, who took care of him in his old age, and spent his days doing what he did best, spinning tales of the mysterious, magical night in the Catskills when time had stood still for him. Rip's story became a favorite of the townspeople, who would gather around to hear him recount the strange men, the ninepins, and his 2-decade-long sleep. Though some doubted its truth, others whispered that his tale was a warning, a reminder that the Catskill Mountains were an otherworldly place where time had a mind of its own. And so Rip Van Winkle lived out the rest of his days, content in the knowledge that while the world may change, some things, like a good story, are timeless.